Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got in front of me today is one of the Imperial Swamp Troopers, better known as Mudskulls, which, splashing around in the muck like they do, you can kind of get a feel for where that nickname would have come from. Now, these guys first appeared, at least as far as I've seen, in Solo, and the uniform look is starting to creep into other shows like Andor as well. So I thought it would be fun to have a go cracking out the paints with something like this. Now the miniature itself comes via Darkfire Designs. This guy is a 3D print. He's come off of my Mars 3, and he is part of the November offering for their Patreon. They also will be selling the STLs via their website in, I believe it starts in December, and you'll be able to pick up physical prints as well. They have licensed printers worldwide, so don't worry if you don't have your own 3D printer. As always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below for this one. So, let's get started. Just before we get to the painting, I want to show you one of the options that you have if you go the route of printing these yourselves at home. Instead of printing the complete miniatures, you can actually print them in kits, which lets you do some pretty cool stuff. The parts from each aren't 100% interchangeable because some of the poses will look quite peculiar depending on how you put them together. But the option of swapping heads and torsos and what have you is there, as well as building them without the capes entirely, which is pretty cool. But yeah, rather than printing them in one piece, as I have, so this fella over here, he is one piece with a head. The heads come separate and all of the Darkfire design stuff, which is really cool. And yeah, you do get a masked version with no gas hoses, and an open-faced version too if you want to paint a couple of guys who have their faces out. I like the sinister, faceless look of the Empire, so that's what I've gone for. Now once he is assembled, I've hit him with a primer spray of Stormvermin Fur, which unfortunately isn't available anymore, but I ran out of Mechanica Standard Grey, which would be my usual pick. Any medium grey will work fine for your primer. What you'll need then is a little bit of Stormvermin Fur from the pot, just to cover over his tunic, which is the top section, because his top and his trousers, they tend to be two different colors. So I'm just going to put a little bit of Stormvermin Fur from the pot over that anyway, just to show you, it's nice and quick. Now that might take 2 coats to get a solid color, depending on what primer you're using. It took 1 for me because I was using the same color over top. I'm going to use now Eshin Grey, and this I'm going to paint in his trousers and his gloves. Now there's no reason saying that you couldn't paint his trousers, cape, and gloves all in the same color, but most of the stills I've seen, the trousers tend to look just a little bit lighter rather, than the cape. The cape is the just off black. So Eshin Grey over the trousers and his little gloves. Now we're going to paint in any black details, and I'm starting off with a big medium base brush because we'll start with his cape. This is German Grey, and you'll see it's a very dark, just off black. It's kind of a blue-black, rather than Corvus black, which is more of it's a straight black-grey sort of color. I'm just going to lay down the base coats up to close to the rest of the miniature, and then I'm going to swap to a smaller brush to do the rest of these details. And I'll also use the same color to paint in the little black section of his visor. You don't need to be terribly careful here, because we're going to go over the outside with some silver later, and we'll also use it to paint in his boots. Now same too, we know that these straps around his calves are going to be that Felgrau color later, but if you hit them, don't worry. Now if you miss any bits on his boots, don't worry too much. You've seen the finished product, you know, whoops, it's not going to stay that color for long. We're going to paint in the section on his arm, which is red. I'm using Mephiston Red for this. What I'm going to do is flip him upside down, because I'm going to find it a little easier to start up close to the sleeve that I've already painted, and then paint up and away, because again, we're going to paint the armor later. And now we can finally start painting in the armor. Now here I'm using German Field Grey from Vallejo. There isn't really a direct equivalent to this in the Citadel range. You might try Deathcore Drab and mix in a little bit of a lighter green or even a grey. But I'd recommend, if you can pick it up, and you're going to be painting a lot of Imperial troops, field grey is not a bad thing to have. See, it's a little darker and a little bit more green than our Stormvermin Fur. And it will cover over very well whether you're using Stormvermin Fur primer or something else. A grey, it'll work perfectly. Now at this point, if there's any last minute black bits that you need to paint in, for example the strap on his helmet, I've quite forgotten. I'm going to go back to my German grey and straighten that up. Now I've got some Iron Warriors, which is a really dark metallic colour. If you want, you can make this by mixing a little bit of black into pretty much any other silvery colour. But this is what I'm going to use to paint in his blaster. Now I'm going to use just a little bit of Iron Hand steel to paint in some of, funnily enough, the steel details. And so I might do some of this off camera. But remembering, of course, that any splash over you make here, you can tidy up with your field grey or what have you before we get to shading. It's not too taxing. Right, now the last colour we're going to apply to our trooper himself is some Mournfang brown on these little ammo pouches, which are totally not MP40 stick magazines. So once you've got all of your base coats down and done any last minute tidy up you need to, it's time to apply a shade. I did very quickly jam in a grey on the rock there, basalt grey. It doesn't matter, you just pick whatever colour you like there. What I've got for my shade, this is a half and half mix of Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian medium. And it's important here because first off, I don't want a really dark shade. I want the shading effect and I want a nice brown in all of the recesses, but I don't want it to tint the material itself over much. As well, the other cool thing about the medium is that it doesn't matter then if I'm using the new or the old Agrax Earthshade. Once you thin it out with the medium, its flow properties and all that, it will be exactly the same. So, something to bear in mind. Once you've given that a good shake, let's start bucketing this, no great surprise, over the entire miniature. Make sure that you're getting it in everywhere. Really jam it into the recesses if you have to. And then I'm going to pop this up near the radiator and leave it to dry for about half an hour. Isn't that magic? I really like how that turns out. Thinning out the shade really makes a difference to the color it's going to give you, but you'll see even on the black we still have a little bit of depth to it, which is just off of the shade. It's really easy to do. What I am going to add is just a fraction more shade. I have some Nuln Oil here, and I'm going to go over his blaster with it. I do want that to be a little bit darker. Alright, now what I'm going to do is to add some goop to the base, so we've got a little bit of texture. I'm using here Astrogranite debris because it's what I've got my hands on. I'd suggest if you've got, what's it called, Stirland Battlemire or Stirland, the big chunky thick one, which is dark brown, that's probably going to be a better option. What I'm going to do is lay quite a thick layer of this over the top of my base and then use a stiff bristled old brush to kind of poke some shapes into it. So let's get a layer down first and then damp one of your, like I said, really nasty, gnarly old brushes and start giving it a little bit more texture. What I'm going to do with this one is to work a little puddly shape into roughly the center here. It doesn't matter too much if it's not perfect, I just want a splash area that I can play around with later. Now while that dries, we can carry on doing other things to the miniature. Just mind your fingers when you come near the base. First off, what I've got is Filthy Cape from the Army Painter, and I'm using this because it's a really good highlight for Stormvermin Fur that we don't have to mix. If you want to, what you could do would be to add a little bit of, say, Administratum Grey or something to your Stormvermin Fur, but I don't think, if you can get your hands on the Army Painter stuff, this is just a much quicker solution. Now, if you want to highlight that Eshin Grey, you can turn to a little bit of Stormvermin Fur. Honestly, it is the perfect solution here. Just grab yourself some fresh stuff, thin it down a little, and away you go. Don't forget the backs of his knuckles on his gloves. When it comes to his cape, rather than painstakingly highlighting every fold, what I've got is a tiny wee bit of Dawnstone and a nice large dry brush. What I'm going to do, you'll see very lightly, just flicking over the edges to catch the raised detail. And if I pass over them a few times, I can slowly build up the color rather than sort of overdoing it in one go and getting a big ugly blob. Always the trick with dry brushing, take it slow. Now once you've finished with this, if you don't like how it looks, what you can do is get some black Nuln Oil or something like that and just go over the top of it to bring it all together again. But I think that's going to look just fine. So we've got a bit of texture on his cape. Let's flip him around and think about how we want to do the armor. It is up to you at this stage whether or not you want to highlight this at all, because the armor is kind of a plasticky finish, so in reality it probably wouldn't catch the light as we're going to paint it here. What I've got is a wee touch of green-grey from Vallejo, and again, if you don't want to use this, you could mix a little bit of grey or even an off-white into your base color here. But all I'm going to do is just catch the tops of these equipment. They're not really pouches, I guess, are they? They'd be cases. But parts of the armor that I want to catch the light a little. I'm just going to do a wee bit of this at the edges. And once you're satisfied with your armor highlights, a little bit of Skrag brown, and we'll just highlight these ammo pouches. Now this, like the armor, is totally optional because a lot of this is going to end up covered in mud and muck. But I tend to find if you do it anyway, then anywhere that you miss, because the mud is going to be random, so you can't guarantee what parts of what you haven't highlighted are still going to be visible. So just highlight it, even if you think it's going to disappear. And once you're satisfied that your mud is completely dry, we're going to add our first mud color. And for this I'm going to use Dryad bark. Just jam it on there. A nasty old brush is going to be your best bet for this. And funnily enough, you're not going to be too concerned if you do hit the boots as we go. Now once you've got all of this covered on the base, I've got then a little bit of packing foam, and I have a pair of tweezers which actually close when there's no pressure applied to them, which is super useful for this. We're going to dab our little foam brush into the same Dryad bark, dab most of it off, and then, oh, this is always the hard part, pick a part of his leg and we're just going to start splotching fairly messily up the leg. And we can go as high as we want. If you want him to look like he's been out in the field for a while and he's properly caked in gunk, go nuts. We're just using this to dab on some random patches of mud. Now, is there a point at which you can go overboard with this? Yeah, but it's really fun. So remember as well that his hands and forearms, he's likely to be grubbing around in the mud with that as well. So even if you don't want to put a whole lot of it on his top, remember that he's going to be reaching out into this stuff. I've made sure that I haven't added much, or any at all really, on his hood, but plenty on the cape itself, back of his legs, and up to about his waist. And now we're going to pick our dry mud color. Now here I'm going to use Baneblade brown, and we're going to be fairly sparing with this because it is quite a light brown. But by comparison, it's going to look properly dry, and will give us some really nice patches. So you want to be a little more careful with this as you apply it, because this is where it's going to overpower things quite quickly. It will look way lighter going on than it does as it dries. But little splashes of this, and you can just jam it with your finger if you don't like how it comes out. But take your time here, using the same technique. And let's add a bit of dry dirt to some of our trailing edges. Now there's our grubby boy. We've got a couple of things left to do to finish off the base, but the miniature itself is finished. So what I've got here is some Instar Plus varnish, Instar Varnish Plus rather. What I'm going to do, this is a super matte varnish, is to apply this over everything except his blaster. It's going to give us a really nice matte finish to everything, and it's going to make most of this dust and grime look really dry and caked on. So I don't want it to pool anywhere too much, but a quick coat of this will do the job to matte this down really nicely. Now the beautiful thing about that matte varnish is that it will bring together some of the colors, but others, like that dry mud, it'll really make it stark and stand out. So if we spin him round, you see what a difference it makes to the cape. How cool is that? I could probably have added a little bit more darker brown into the recesses, but I kind of figure the high points are where it's going to be most noticeable anyhow. What I need to do is to dry brush the top of the base, and I'm going to stick to my Baneblade brown for this. And we do not need to be terribly careful with this at all. Just a couple of quick blasts just to lighten up the edges of the mud. And if we should happen to hit his boots on the way around, oh well. Now you'll see that little area that I poked out earlier. I've left that without hitting it with the dry brush, and that's because I have a cunning plan. What I've got is just any old brush and a big dollop of Ardcoat. Any gloss varnish will work here, and I'm just going to splatter that quite thickly into our little puddle that we've made from earlier. And as well, I'll just dab a couple of little wet patches of this just at random on other areas of the mud. Now while that was drying, I've also painted the rim of the base in Rhinox hide. And you'll see you'll still end up, even when it's thoroughly dry, there's a bit of a translucency to it where you can see some white goopiness in there. Don't worry too much about that. We're going to just go straight over the top with some Athonian Camoshade. And you'll see it doesn't really cover terribly well on a glossy surface like we've applied. But don't worry if it collects strangely, because we want it to look like, scunge and goop that is running over these little puddles. So if you fancy, anywhere that you've put a little bit of the varnish, hit it now with some Camoshade and just run over the edges of those patches a little to make them look properly squelchy. The downside, of course, is that those shades will ordinarily dry matte. So I've got a little bit more of the Ardcoat, and I'm just going to paint that over the top of these. Once that's done and dried, let's get a look at what he looks like when he's all finished. And there at last, our Mudskull is complete. Now, I always really enjoy painting Star Wars miniatures. There's just something fun about them. And getting right down to the bottom end of the Empire is always really interesting. So thank you again to Darkfire Designs for letting me have a play around with these. And like I said, they are still available through Patreon for November, and then they'll be available through the website, which I will link below. As well, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep buying resin. Any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.